Welcome to Let's Connect Greater Portland, a show about the changes and the challenges we face and the great things that people are doing to make Greater Portland a fantastic place to live, work, and play. I'm Kristina Egan, your host. Today, we're talking about how climate change will impact our coastal communities and what efforts are underway to help those communities adapt to this changing world. I'm here with Dave Reidmiller, the director of the Climate Center at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. He's worked for both the Obama and Trump administrations on federal climate policy. Now, he works with Maine's most vulnerable communities to ensure they are prepared for climate change. What are your burning questions about climate change? We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to call in at any time, 207-780-4909. Again, 780-4909. Dave, we're so glad to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thanks, Kristina. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I would like our listeners to get to know you a little bit first. And, climate change is something that a lot of people are concerned about. But how did you get into climate change? What was the reason that you decided to make this your career path?
Yeah, I have always been interested in the natural sciences. How does the Earth system work? How is it changing? And, in graduate school, I became increasingly interested in understanding not just how and why the Earth system is changing, but really what are the societal implications of that. And so upon graduating, moved to Washington, D.C. to really start a career really at that nexus of climate science and policy.
So let's talk a little bit about how the world is changing, and particularly our world here in Maine. What's happening with climate change? What are the latest trends that you're observing from a scientific perspective?
Yeah, well, I think what we're seeing is that the realities of climate change are becoming more and more clear every day, and frankly, in every corner of the world. And so, whether it's in trends in sea ice cover or ice sheet retreat, or ocean warming, acidification, sea level rise. You could look across any ecosystem really and see significant changes that are occurring as a result of the greenhouse gas emissions that humanity is putting into the atmosphere.
And I'm thinking just this week in central Maine, there was a tremendous amount of rain and some flooded roads. So we've seen it just even this week.
Yeah, that's right. Extreme precipitation is certainly, one of many climate impacts that is going to impact the Northeast region. I think most people kind of understand now that as the atmosphere warms, it has the capacity to hold more water vapor. And as a result, you can have these much more extreme heavy precip events.
And we know that the ocean is warming and the Gulf of Maine is warming. Tell us a little bit about what's happening there and how that might affect how the oceans circulate.
Sure. The Gulf of Maine as a body of water, as many listeners will probably know, is among the fastest warming bodies of water in the entire world. It's fasting at a rate that is about almost 3.5 times as fast as the global average.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty stark.
Do we know why our particular ocean is warming faster?
Yeah, there's a lot. It's an active area of research. There are several kind of leading hypotheses, and one of the big reasons is kind of the influence of these major ocean currents, right? Historically, the Gulf of Maine has been largely influenced by the Labrador Current, which has brought cooler waters from the Arctic region into the Gulf of Maine. And over time, I think folks know that the Arctic obviously is probably the fastest warming place on planet Earth. And so that Labrador Current is bringing warmer Arctic water into the Gulf of Maine. At the same time, we're also influenced by the Gulf Stream current, which brings warm water from the tropics into the mid-latitudes. And what we're also seeing, though, is that the Gulf Stream itself, the influence of the Gulf Stream in the Gulf of Maine, is increasing. So I like to use kind of a bathtub analogy, where you've got kind of the Labrador Current as kind of the cold water faucet, and the water coming out of that cold water faucet is actually warming up, and then the Gulf Stream is that warm water faucet. And you're kind of turning up that warm water faucet at the same time. So you're kind of getting a bit of a double whammy from climate change into the Gulf of Maine.
What's happening to everything that lives in the Gulf of Maine as those temperatures go up?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of things changing, right? So we're seeing the introduction of new species, things like longfin squid and black sea bass, other species.
Yum.
Yeah, there's new opportunities there, that's for sure. But we're also starting to see, the emergence potentially of new pathogens, new diseases, food system or food web interactions that we don't quite understand yet. And so there's a lot of change happening, and frankly, it's happening at a rate that the species themselves are unable to adapt to. And I think that's a really important point, is that over geological timescales, species have sort of been able to adapt to changes in their environment. But it's that rate of change that's happening now that is really pushing some species beyond their particular limits.
Yeah, not enough generations to adapt to the
That's exactly
rate
right.
of the environment changing.
Exactly.
And let's talk a little bit about sea level rise also. My understanding is you were talking about how the atmosphere can now hold more water, which is creating more rain.
Right.
But the water in the ocean, as it warms, it also kind of expands in volume, right?
That's exactly right.
So tell us what we can expect to see along the coast of Maine in terms of sea level rise.
Sure. So there's a few contributors to sea level rise globally. The kind of most intuitive one sometimes is sort of the melting ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, also melting glaciers in Canada and Russia and elsewhere. But the other part of it that is super important in basic physics is that when you heat up water, it expands, as you said. And that's really been the dominant contributor to date. Over time, the contributions from those melting ice sheets will certainly increase. And what we've seen is that over the past 50 plus years or so in the Gulf of Maine, sea levels have risen by about 8 or 9 inches. And they're increasing at what we call a nonlinear exponential rate here. And so the rate of sea level rise here in the Gulf of Maine is faster than the global average, is faster than the national average. And so we're starting to see, more and more kind of those sunny day flooding days that we kind of historically have associated with Miami, much more locally here in downtown Portland and throughout the coast.
Yeah, we've seen it down in the Bayside area along Marginal Way and Route 1 in Scarborough.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, so we're expecting to see more of that, you're saying?
Absolutely. And I will say that the city is obviously keenly aware of the risks that some of these low-lying places face, and have done some pretty good work to try to build resilience to some of these impacts. So if you go down to the Bayside neighborhood in the city of Portland now, you'll see that on days where there historically would have been, kind of sunny day flooding, if there is any now, it can be much lower, and part of that is because they've installed, some kind of one-way valves that sort of help prevent some of that seawater from coming up through the storm drains, and that's a really, a really important adaptation measure that the city has taken.
And at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, you are working with a lot of vulnerable communities. So Portland is one, but are you seeing cities and towns starting to take action to? I mean, they could install those valves you were talking about, but there are probably other things also that they are
Absolutely.
doing.
There's 140 or so coastal communities in the state of Maine. And
that's a lot of cities and towns, yeah.
There's quite a few of them. And we have a coastline here, over 3,500 miles of tidally influenced coastline. It's extraordinary.
Isn't that like almost the distance to California?
It's bigger than California's coastline.
If you pulled it out, stretched it out, yeah.
It really is, and obviously most of it is quite rural, and in many cases does not have a ton of municipal capacity or frankly the financial resources to really grapple with some of the gnarly issues that climate change can pose to these regions.
And some of these towns, they have a public works director and a manager and not much else because they're so small.
That's exactly right, yeah. And I will say, the state has really been, at the forefront of leadership on climate action over the past few years. And we saw that in part, at the beginning of Governor Mills' administration, the establishment of the Maine Climate Council, the Maine Won't Wait climate action plan, and that kind of momentum and frankly some of the resources that the state legislature has put behind it through programs like the Community Resilience Partnership has really catalyzed a lot of both planning and action at the municipal level across all of those coastal municipalities. And importantly, not just those coastal municipalities, but further inland as well.
We're going to talk more about hope coming up, and I want to remind everybody that we're listening right now to Let's Connect Greater Portland, and I'm talking with Dave Reidmiller, who is the director of the Climate Center at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, talking all things climate change in Maine. And we would welcome you calling in and sharing with Dave and with me what makes you hopeful about climate change, or maybe some concerns you might have about how climate change might affect where you're living. You can call in at 780-4909. Again, 780-4909. So, Dave, let's talk about hope. You started setting us up by talking about the leadership that the state has really taken by establishing a climate action plan. Maine Won't Wait. It's set some targets for emissions reduction. We've also set some targets for enhancing community resilience. Mm-hmm. So let's settle in a little bit on the community resilience part. Tell us what the state is doing in order to help communities really prepare.
Yeah, so they've done a couple of things. One is establishing these regional climate collaboratives, and so the state has been, kind of divided in a sense into 4 regions, 2 coastal regions and 2 inland regions, and they've really empowered coordinators to work with municipalities, nonprofits, academic institutions, and even the private sector to, better characterize what risks communities face, what potential response options are, and importantly, moving into the phase of implementation. How do we get the financing and the resources in place, frankly, capitalizing on a lot of the funding that's coming through at the federal level to really act on the vulnerability assessments, the resilience plans, the mitigation measures that are coming up through these planning processes.
You told us about the one-way valves down on Marginal Way. Sure. What are some other examples of ways that municipalities are planning to enhance their resilience to climate change and extreme weather? Yeah,
so there's a range of kind of response options, right? And I think one of the most important things to remember is that any proposed solution is no lasting solution at all if it's not based on a transparent and inclusive planning process. And that's one thing we really like to emphasize at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, is that the engagement of the community members, the affected constituencies, is critically important to make sure that whatever solution is a lasting one. And so, a lot of these are, kind of at the forefront of engineering solutions. How can we elevate coastal infrastructure? How can we integrate nature-based solutions where they're possible and appropriate?
What's a nature-based solution?
Yeah, some of that could be restoring marshlands, right? I like to think about a lot of nature-based solutions as having kind of this triple win, right? You have kind of a climate adaptation component from sort of wave attenuation from stronger storms and sea level rise. You have kind of an emissions mitigation benefit because they're pretty powerful, what we call carbon sinks, so they absorb carbon out of the atmosphere. And they also provide a real biodiversity win as well, because they provide valuable habitat for spawning creatures and juvenile species of all sorts. So
have you seen any of these nature-based solutions implemented in Maine?
There are a few in test measures. There are folks at the Maine Geological Survey. The state is blessed with really talented folks, Pete Slavinsky and Steve Dixon among them there, who go out, really characterize kind of the coastal zone, the beach environments, the kind of the health of the beaches, and frankly where some opportunities are to kind of implement some of these solutions. And they're happening throughout the state, but it's not necessarily possible in every place, of course.
Yeah, and some things that people think of as ways to prevent damage, like seawalls, can actually just move the damage further down the coast, right?
That's exactly right. I think a lot of times, an initial response to sea level rise and coastal flooding is to build gray infrastructure or to armor ourselves against the encroaching ocean. And what that can do is not only, be detrimental to the dunes and other types of coastal environment, but really all that does is it diverts the water to the adjacent regions. And oftentimes those adjacent regions are the ones that don't have the financial resources in the first place to protect themselves. So it really kind of exacerbates this cycle of inequality potentially.
Yeah. We've got a caller on the line, Dave, a man named Daniel calling from Old Orchard Beach. Daniel, go ahead.
Hi, yes. Thank you for taking my call, and thanks to your guest for talking about the issue. So I've been hearing the term climate change being used as the description for this, increasing heat and carbon in the air and causing, the changes. And for one, I am a believer that man-made pollution is the cause of climate change. I think that my problem is that when we use the term climate change as the descriptor for the problem we are facing, that becomes it's too simplified and it becomes politicized. And so the fossil fuel companies, et cetera, the polluters, can argue all day that climate change is, been happening for millions of years, and, you can't change the climate. And so, I'm hearing so much about climate change, and yet really my issue is with pollution, and that's the real issue that we're dealing with, and that it's, not only causing global warming in so many different ways, but it's also affecting our health. So
that's right, Daniel.
In the 60s, it was about pollution and DMT and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and how they were, the destruction of the chemicals. And now I'm hearing climate change, and yet nothing is being done. Or very little is being done, in my opinion. And, we're stuck with more cars and very, very little change.
So, Daniel, I'm going to ask you to wrap it up. Do you have a question for David?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what you see as being, the actual, if you could sum it up in a couple sentences, what the problem we're facing and what the presidents are going to talk about next year, and is climate change going to be one of those pressing issues,
Great.
and how we're going to change it.
Daniel, thank you so much for your very comprehensive question. And I do know that there's been a lot of conversation about, are we using the right words when we talk about climate change? Change can be good, and Daniel's mentioning pollution. We know carbon pollution, methane pollution. These are greenhouse gas emissions that are wreaking havoc with our climate. So what do you think is, can you answer this question?
I think Daniel actually articulated the concerns that a lot of folks have, around the world, frankly, that, to endeavor to sum up what he said, that we're simply not acting fast enough, right? And I think that is a shared sentiment around the world. I think, one of the important things to keep in mind, right, is that, yes, climate change is driven by human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, and that primarily comes from the combustion of fossil fuels, whether that be through power plants or transportation or industrial processes. One of the obvious challenges, of course, is that acting on climate change, working to reduce those emissions, poses, a real threat to millions of people around the world and their livelihoods, right? And so we need to not just dismiss that concern, but to really sort of listen to those concerns and really try to seek out opportunities to either evolve the workforce or find other economic opportunities, right? I used to be a State Department negotiator and on climate change, and I remember engaging with my counterparts in Saudi Arabia, and they would pull me aside and say, "Look, I'm sympathetic to the plight of the small island states, and that they see climate change as an existential threat to their sovereignty, but at the same time, we see action on climate change as an existential threat to our sovereignty because our economy is based on fossil fuels, and if the world were to move quickly away from fossil fuels, that could cause absolute chaos, social disruption, economic upheaval." And, so I think there's, and that plays out obviously domestically as well. We see that with a lot of national level politics in coal country and fossil fuel producing states. I think over time we've realized, that we've put a finer point on what the causes of climate change are, and more and more investment has been made to try and diversify economies. And that's not just at the corporate level, you're starting to see some of the major oil and gas players, we could argue about whether it's enough, but diversify their investments. But you're seeing it, in some of these kind of nationalized oil companies as well. And so, again, to the caller's point, we're certainly not acting fast enough, but to stem off the worst impacts. But
it's complicated, right? Yeah, there's a lot that we need to do, particularly in Maine, to make sure that we're capturing the economic opportunities that are posed by climate change, while at the same time taking aggressive action to really reduce the amount that we continue to pollute the atmosphere.
That's right. And I'll just say one quick point on that. When taken as a whole, the cost of inaction, basically the damages from climate change, dwarf the cost of acting on climate change. But that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be very real people who are affected by acting on climate change. And I think we need to acknowledge that and find ways to sort of, minimize that disruption and impact to those people.
And again, we've seen some leadership at the state level as we've been seeing folks being worked into the workforce in kind of solar and other ways that we can generate.
Absolutely.
We have another call in from Jim in Gorham. Go ahead, Jim.
Let's see.
Jim, can you speak up just a bit?
I live about a half an hour in from Portland, inland.
Mm-hmm.
And I and some neighbors are noticing our lands are being a lot more flooded even after the drought. After the drought. During the drought, my land and my neighbor's land got much, much wetter. And I wonder if any of that could be related to sea level, where the sea is so big, it's not just going to be on the coast.
Thank you, Jim, for your question. So the question is whether any of the flooding that we're seeing more inland is related to sea level rise, or maybe there's a different cause.
It's really going to be site specific. So I am reluctant to sort of pontificate on the exact site that the caller is talking about, but there's a couple of factors at play here. One is, yes, as sea levels rise, the water can, kind of infiltrate inland through kind of the groundwater and through kind of the geology. We don't quite have the geology in the state of Maine that is particularly problematic for that, which is in contrast to South Florida, for example, where, you have this limestone that really does kind of facilitate that kind of subterranean
water
transport.
Can just flow from the ocean right into the inland parts of Florida, but we don't have that in Maine, you're saying?
Not necessarily, yeah. And what is possible, though, is that, as we talked about at the top of the show, we're seeing heavier rainfall events, right? And especially when those heavier rainfall events, for example, were to occur on the back of a drought where the land is parched, it's basically dumping a whole bunch of water on more or less an impervious surface now. And so because that soil is so hardened, it can't absorb it as well. And so you can certainly see much more flooding when you get that heavy rainfall in the wake of a drought. And that's certainly what we were seeing initially about a year ago when we had been experiencing quite significant drought. Obviously, over the past 9 months or so, the tables have turned quite significantly. And now we're seeing flooding as a result of just extraordinary stream flows and some erosion that's happening on the side of those riparian zones.
Yeah, and I know even our little garden at our house, we've had our seeds washed out many times.
Sure.
This has been a very, very wet summer. I would like to go back to something that you and I were talking about before we got on air, which is about climate anxiety. And I know at the Greater Portland Council of Governments, many of our younger team members are quite worried about the future. We also know that we've got some state leadership. We have a tremendous amount of federal money that's flowing into the state that could help us prepare and actually mitigate. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how hopeful you are. You're on the front lines of science. You're on the front lines, actually, of political action as you're working in these smaller municipalities. What do you think about our future? Is there reason for us to be hopeful?
We always have to have hope. I mean, humanity has historically, accomplished extraordinary things over time, and this will be no different, right? the very nature of climate change as a problem can be just so daunting as to be almost paralyzing, right? Because it really touches every corner of people's lives, every corner of a country's economy. And as a result, it can be like, where do I start? What can I do as an individual, right? President Xi in China, President Biden in America, like as individuals, they cannot solve climate change, which is why collective action globally is so important, things like the Paris Agreement. And I think it's important for all of us to kind of ask ourselves, what can I do as an individual? I, as an individual, am not going to solve climate change, but I, as an individual, can certainly contribute to the solution, right? And I think that's a really important framework to take on. What can I do? How can I both act as an individual, catalyze action within my community, and then, participate in the processes that are going to affect change at a larger level?
So I love that when we think about what individually we can do. We can try to walk and bike more. We can try to carpool if we have the resources, try to use an electric vehicle on the transportation side. What are some of the things that maybe people want to do to try to make sure that their homes are more resilient also as we start to see these weather patterns change?
Yeah, I think one of the probably least sexy but most important things we can do is increase the efficiency of our homes, right? So basically, you want to reduce as much energy use as you can, and part of that comes with thinking about insulation, weather stripping. These types of pretty low cost solutions that can have a pretty significant impact, not just on your utility bills, but also on the broader emissions profile. And the state has a number of fantastic incentive programs through Efficiency Maine that can really help, lower that cost of entry. And I think it's a great program that we have here at the state that has really, frankly, enabled us, for example, to reach our heat pump installation goals several years ahead of schedule. And so I think Governor Mills just recently announced that they're basically increasing the goal because we've had such success in that space. And
it's great to see that. That's definitely a reason for hope. And I remember also at the top of the program, we were talking about the importance of including residents in the development of climate plans for municipalities. And our two agencies, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and the Greater Portland Council of Governments, worked together along with the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission to work with municipalities. Are there ways that you think that people can get involved in some of those planning efforts in their own communities?
Absolutely. In the state of Maine, right, many municipalities are in the process of updating their comprehensive plans. I'm a South Portland resident, and they are actively seeking community engagement and informing that process. But a number of other communities in the region are doing similar. If it's not a comprehensive plan process, it's a climate action planning process. And I think it's really important to engage, elevate what you care about in a given community, make sure that the people that are in decision-making positions for your municipality are aware of what you care about, how it's at risk, and what can be done to sort of ameliorate those risks and, frankly, potentially capitalize on some of the opportunities that may be in the future.
That's great. So we've talked about what you can do as an individual, what you can do as an individual to get involved in municipal planning. And I know we've also had on the air before Climate Work Maine, which is working with businesses to take action, not only on how they can reduce their emissions and kind of procure things in a more climate-friendly way, but also ways that they can really engage in making sure that businesses are doing everything that they can.
Yeah, Climate Work Maine is actually a great partner for the Gulf of Maine Research Institute as well. We've been working with them to provide technical assistance to blue economy businesses to capitalize on new federal funding to decarbonize and build resilience in their supply chain. So it's a great new organization, and it's an important partner for us.
Very cool. And I have to say that it's nice to get a little boost of hope from you today. So I really appreciate you coming on the show, Dave.
My pleasure, Kristina. It's been a lot of fun.
I also want to thank Joshua Brister, who is today's sound engineer, and WMPG, who collaborates with the Greater Portland Council of Governments in producing the show. You can reach us on Instagram at Let's Connect Radio. Join us next week for another conversation about the great work that's happening in our communities. Until then, be kind to yourself and to each other. I'm Kristina Egan. See you next time on Let's Connect Greater Portland.